this. We must preserve our planet for the sake of future generations. Today is also the launch of Dr. Samantha Montana's book, Disastertology, so please stay tuned until the end so we could draw your name to see who receives a free copy of her book. Please contact jono.kportclimate.org to inquire about your prize. And you could also type in the chat if you need to hear that again or if you have any questions. Now, Dr. Samantha Montana is an assistant professor of emergency management at Massachusetts Maritime Academy. She holds a BS degree in psychology from Loyola University, New Orleans, and an MS and PhD in emergency management from North Dakota State University. And here's a little intro into disasterology. With temperatures rising and the risk of disasters growing, our world is increasingly vulnerable. Most people see disasters as freak natural events that are unpredictable and unpreventable, but that simply isn't the case. Disasters are avoidable, but when they do strike, there are strategic ways to manage the fallout. In Disasterology, Dr. Montano, a disaster researcher, brings readers with her on an eye-opening journey through some of our worst disasters. She explains why we aren't doing enough to prevent or prepare for disasters, the critical role of media, and how our approach to recovery was not designed to serve marginalized communities. Dr. Montano offers a preview of what will happen to our communities if we don't take aggressive, immediate action. In a section devoted to the COVID-19 pandemic, our generation's most deadly disaster, she casts light on many decisions made behind closed doors that failed to protect the public. Disasterology is essential reading for anyone who wants to understand how our country handles disasters and how we can better face them together. And finally, I would like to introduce you all to Dr. Samantha Montana. Give it up.
Thank you, Alan. I appreciate that. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. All right. So today I wanted to talk with you all about kind of how I ended up doing the work that I do today, and kind of how disaster work connects in with emergency management. So I know some of you here are disaster people. I've been looking at the names, and some of you are more on the climate side of things. So we'll kind of, some of this will be familiar to some of you, some of it will be new. So I first got started doing disaster work in New Orleans post-Katrina. I had an opportunity to go to New Orleans to volunteer many months after the storm actually happened to help gut homes, help rebuild homes. And I was 16 at the time. I grew up on the East Coast, and so I was pretty far removed from what had actually happened in New Orleans. You know, I'd watched it on the news, but it wasn't really until I was physically standing there in the city that I was able to really kind of comprehend the scope and scale of the destruction in the city. There's kind of a huge difference of kind of seeing this aerial view, even though, you know, 80% of the city is underwater, still seeing that from above, and then actually kind of being there, standing on the street, seeing these, you know, mountains of debris standing on, you know, on every single street corner, really kind of changes your perspective of what has happened. And so in that week that I was in New Orleans, we met with and worked with a lot of different nonprofits. We worked with all of these volunteers. We worked with New Orleanians, survivors, homeowners who were trying to rebuild their homes. And despite the fact that there were, you know, hundreds of organizations, thousands of volunteers there doing all of this work, it was very clear that it wasn't enough, that there were still people who were not getting the help that they needed. And really that the city was kind of radiating injustice at the time. And so I reflected a lot on that experience and decided that I would move to New Orleans to help with the recovery for the long term. So I ended up being able to go to school in New Orleans, and then on the side work with all of these different recovery organizations who were, doing everything from rebuilding houses to helping homeowners fill out paperwork, like insurance paperwork, FEMA paperwork, helping elderly folks find social service resources that were needed, helping connect parents with childcare so they could go do recovery work, kind of anything that needed to be done related to the recovery. There was a nonprofit or an organization in the city that was trying to do that work. And so throughout those years that I spent in New Orleans, I learned about how horrible the recovery process is for kind of obvious reasons. We usually focus on the actual response to a disaster, but there is this whole other disaster, some survivors call it the second disaster, that comes afterwards in the recovery, right? People can't just quickly rebuild their homes and move on with their lives. There's this really kind of complicated and kind of poorly designed recovery system that they have to find a way to navigate themselves through. So while I was in New Orleans, the BP oil disaster happened along the coast 5 years later in 2010. And I, at the time, would have called myself an environmentalist, but I would not have necessarily called myself a climate change activist or a climate activist at all. I was just very focused on doing disaster recovery work in New Orleans. And so I wasn't thinking as much about climate change as, in retrospect, I probably should have been. But I had been working with a lot of environmental groups in the city of New Orleans that were doing things kind of within the recovery context. So they were helping homeowners put solar panels on their new homes when they were built. We were, building community gardens. We were, installing energy efficient light bulbs, kind of those like very traditional environmental tasks that the movement has kind of traditionally done. But when BP happened along the coast, many of those environmental groups that were working in New Orleans moved our attention down to the coast, right? There was this kind of more urgent need along the coast. And so I spent time kind of commuting back and forth from New Orleans, working with these groups, national groups that were coming in, and working with the local communities that were most affected along the coast by the oil coming ashore on the actual response to the disaster, which was something that was pretty new for me. I hadn't really been there for a response before. And I started to see that some of those problems that we saw in the response to Katrina, the issues with communication, the issues with coordination, the unequal responses, the lack of leadership, a lot of that was being replicated again in the context of the BP disaster. And this was something at the time that was really surprising for me, because the narrative that I had been hearing for years about Katrina was that this was a relatively unique event, that this was something that wasn't probably going to happen again, that this was just on this like high end of the scale. These failures were, a product of these very specific decisions that were made by a handful of individuals, and that, we needed to make some changes, but, overall, this was still an outlier event. But as I watched the BP response unfold, again, I saw these same things, this, confusing and conflicting information about what was actually happening during the disaster, the need to coordinate hundreds, if not thousands, of groups and organizations who were responding, people and organizations with wildly different interests, right? You had BP, Halliburton, these other private companies that were responsible for the disaster also being put in charge of parts of that response as as was the Coast Guard and FEMA and the EPA and CDC, right? All of these different agencies were converging on the coast, and all of these challenges were kind of coming to the forefront. And so essentially, as I kind of watched BP unfold, I also started to make some broader connections between disaster work and climate work. So this is a quote from my book, which I won't read it to you, you can read it. But essentially, yeah.
Oh, sorry. It looks like a couple of the participants are seeing if you're using a split screen, possibly the non-presenter mode. And they said it's a little slow.
Voila, is that better?
Perfect, thanks.
And so, as I was along the coast, I was seeing kind of all of a sudden kind of saw this convergence between climate change and the history of the oil and gas industry, and sea level rise, erosion, wetland loss, all of these different factors that were kind of talked about in relatively separate ways at that point, all converged with one another. And then also this, traditional disaster response was unfolding in the midst of it. And it kind of became very clear to me that you couldn't understand why the response was unfolding the way that it was without understanding this much broader context. Decades, centuries of policies that had led the coast of Louisiana to look the way it did, the policies that allowed oil and gas companies to work offshore, and then also to understand the kind of complexity in our response system that led to kind of this confusion and conflict between these different organizations that were involved in the actual response. And so I'm going to throw a little bit of emergency management theory in here, but I started to do more research about disasters, kind of about emergency management itself, to try and kind of teach myself what was happening, right? It was a kind of a very emotional experience, right? You're physically in the communities that are experiencing this turmoil. And there wasn't a lot of context for really explaining what was happening. And so now, in retrospect, I understand that the work I had been doing in New Orleans was situated within what we call the phase of recovery. So the actual rebuilding of communities after a disaster happens. I was also doing a lot of mitigation work in New Orleans, or there was a lot of mitigation work going on, right? As we were rebuilding homes, we were lifting them up so that the next time it flooded, hopefully the water would flow underneath. Obviously, the flood infrastructure system in New Orleans was being rebuilt, but also changed in a number of ways. And we were also doing things to help prepare the city for the next hurricane, right? We were talking about the need to change the evacuation plans for the city. We were talking about the need to make sure that people who don't have access to a car, couldn't financially afford to evacuate, would have the access to those resources. And then so I had been doing kind of 3/4 of that disaster life cycle in New Orleans, but I had kind of been absent from that response portion until BP. And that is actually kind of weirdly the piece that we spend the most time with when we talk about disasters responses, when these life-saving measures are actually happening. And it's what captures the majority of media coverage. The majority of media attention is spent on response, and disaster films, all of those Hollywood movies are focused on the response. And so even then, though, so I kind of started to piece together these different phases, starting to see disasters as kind of this more holistic event that happens rather than, these kind of unique one-off events that just kind of happen and then go away. And so Also around this time, I ended up going to some other disasters around the country, like the Joplin tornado in Missouri, to do some volunteer management. And again, saw these same challenges. We saw how the, these policy decisions that had been made long prior to the actual disaster taking place had come together to create that community's risk. We saw repeatedly these failures in communication and coordination, saw this lack of leadership, saw ineffective media coverage, saw that the way we were approaching recovery especially was reinforcing inequalities within communities. And so kind of based on these experiences that I had, I decided to go to graduate school to actually learn more about emergency management. There were still these kind of big missing pieces, and kind of going through this realization that, it wasn't just that we needed to rebuild homes in New Orleans, it was that we needed to fix the system that exists to respond to these kinds of events. And that if we wanted to do things to actually prevent these disasters from happening, we were going to have to change the way we were even thinking about disasters, the way that we were approaching disasters. And so when I got to graduate school, I was very surprised to find that actually people have been studying disasters for a very, very long time. There's, in North America, there's nearly a century worth of disaster research that explains and can help inform everything that I saw on the ground, all of these, this bullet pointed list of issues that I was seeing and wasn't fully able to articulate at the time. And so using the disaster research, you can really see a roadmap to explain things like this life cycle of disaster, right? This is something that is in the disaster research, right? We use it in practice as well, of course, but this helps you to begin categorizing these various components of disaster response, helps you kind of understand the timing of these issues, the way in which we need to operate as we go through this disaster life cycle, right? We know from looking at the research, we can trace back specific policies that are at the root of risk creation, right? Disasters aren't natural. There are all of these human-made decisions that are creating vulnerabilities, creating risk that lead us to these events when they occur, right? We have a lot of research about how we should be approaching communication, how we should be approaching coordination when disasters do happen. There is, an extensive body of work about the role of leadership in times of crisis and how leadership should be approached. There's research about how media coverage favors some disasters over others, how there's inequality in that coverage, how that coverage can reinforce myths about disasters. And certainly there is plenty of evidence within the research to really illuminate why marginalized communities are bearing the brunt of these disasters, why they are having a difficult time moving through the recovery process, why and how they can be left out of preparedness and mitigation. And so really, I found kind of within this body of disaster research, found that there were a lot of answers, or at least it provided this opportunity for me to be able to articulate all of these problems that I had seen on the ground in communities as they were experiencing these disasters. The other thing that happened around this time is that I started to learn much more about climate change and started to make this connection between disasters and climate change. So when we talk about climate change, the narrative has kind of traditionally been that we need to mitigate climate change itself, but that yes, a change in hazards is one of the consequences of climate change, and that's certainly true. But if we're looking at this from an emergency management perspective, from a disaster perspective, we think about things in terms of risk. So this is a very, very simplified and basic risk equation here. But you have your hazard, right? Your actual hurricane, your actual earthquake, tornado, and then that interacts with us, right? That interacts with our vulnerabilities, whether that's our physical vulnerabilities, our economic vulnerabilities, our social vulnerabilities. And when that interaction happens in a negative way to the point that we become overwhelmed, then we potentially have a disaster. And so when you look at this risk equation, and then you also look at what we know from climate research, we have this pretty big problem here where climate change is affecting every single part of this risk equation, right? We know that climate change is affecting hazards like hurricanes and droughts and heat waves and cold waves and all of these other hazards. And then we also know that climate change is affecting our vulnerabilities, right? It's affecting currently and will continue to affect food production and water supplies, right? All of these other issues that make a community more or less vulnerable is being affected in various ways by climate change. And then we also know this is changing the likelihood of these events happening. And so what that means is that climate change is one of the factors that is contributing to our risk. And when I started studying disasters, there was kind of the body of work being done by climate scientists, and then there were some disaster scholars who were talking about climate change, but in retrospect, actually quite few were talking about climate change and how it would affect specifically the emergency management system and our capacity to respond to these to respond to this changing risk. And so as I started to study disasters more and started to really interrogate these various challenges that we see as we're responding to disasters, climate change became this kind of like dark cloud over everything else, right? Climate change wasn't going to eliminate any of these problems. And in fact, it was going to make many of these problems more challenging. And so one thing that I decided or thought was really important is that disaster researchers start kind of branching out in thinking about who it is we talk to when we're talking about disaster research. Traditionally, disaster researchers were spending a lot of time talking to emergency managers, talking to practice, right? The people who are actually doing emergency management. And that's really important, right? We need to build those bridges, absolutely. But we also know that a lot of other people are involved in emergency management, right? Nonprofits, businesses, the general public, journalists, right? They are central to how a response and a recovery unfolds. And so bringing kind of disaster research to those other stakeholder groups, especially in the kind of context of climate change and increasing risk, became a much more kind of urgent need among disaster research. So as I continue to do disaster research, I try to still keep one foot in the climate movement and to help kind of bring disaster research into the work that climate activists are doing, to bring this research to communities that are on the front lines of managing these impacts, managing these disasters, trying to prevent these disasters from happening, to give them the resources, to give them as much of this knowledge that for me was very obscured when I was in their position, and to try and make it more accessible. So that is what I have for you. I think Alan was gonna do some questions now.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions or anything which is just kind of interesting, which they thought, feel free to type it in the chat. Okay, so we have a question from Owen. I apologize if I butcher your name, but how fast would scientists need to have enough proof through research and provide impactful responses?
Yeah, so well, so one thing to clarify here, right? There are a lot of different kinds of scientists who are talking about disasters, right? So my degree is in emergency management. So I am studying those 4 phases that I talked about, right? Mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. But at the same time, we also have sociologists, psychologists, economists, communication experts, right? Any kind of discipline you can think of are also studying disasters. We also have what I refer to as our hazard scientists. So those are people who are studying climate change itself, meteorologists, geologists, seismologists, volcanologists, hydrologists, right? The people who actually study the hazards. And I would say that the hazard scientists are the ones who are providing kind of the more of the in the moment data that practitioners need to lead a response, right? If you think of your local weather person, for example, right? They have a degree in meteorology. They are looking at satellites. They're analyzing that data in real time. And then they're the ones who are working with the National Weather Service to put out various types of warnings if there is a tornado, right? And so the hazard scientists are working really quickly, right? They're the ones that are, overseeing like tsunami warning systems, earthquake early warning systems. And so their work moves very quickly when something actually happens. A lot of the kind of social scientists, the disaster or the emergency management scholars, our research kind of moves a bit more slowly. And we're working more on thinking about how we can change systems, how we can change policies for kind of making these changes in the long term. Hopefully that answered that question.
Okay, we have another question from Ariel. What better prep could the average person do to help themselves as disasters become more prevalent, to not only help themselves, but their neighbors and communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think about this in a couple different ways. So first of all, what are the things, as you asked, that you can do as an individual? So there are kind of our like common set of preparedness tips, right? If you make sure you have a go bag, make sure you have an emergency kit, right? Make sure you have important paperwork, make sure you have an evacuation plan for your family, right? Keep extra food and water in your house if you're able to. Those are the kinds of things that are, looking at your own kind of self-preservation, you being able to physically get through a disaster for a day or two. At the same time, we also know from the research that we don't really experience disasters as individuals. It tends to be a much more collective experience, right? It's pretty rare that you're going to go through a disaster completely by yourself. You're usually with your family, you're with your neighbors, you're with your coworkers. There are other people there around you. And so when we think about preparedness, we also want to be thinking about this in terms of our collective ability to respond, right? So we say that one of the most important things you can do is get to know your neighbors, make sure you have their phone number, become friends with them. These are things you're building your social capital in your community that will better enable you to work together if something were to happen. But we also want to be thinking about, so those are all good things that are kind of like within our own control that we can do. But we also want to be thinking about this at kind of a community-wide level too, right? When we say that we're prepared for disaster, we're also needing to think about, does our local emergency management agency have enough people working there? Do they have enough money to be doing the trainings that they should be doing? Does our town have enough money to install a warning system? Do we have a plan for how we're going to evacuate people who are disabled and can't evacuate on their own? All of those kinds of things that happen at that more kind of governmental level or at that community level are just as, if not more important than having a go kit in your basement.
Alrighty, we have another question by Laura. How can we better integrate climate change mitigation in emergency management, especially in the preparedness phase? For instance, we know it's a challenge to get people to keep an emergency kit in their homes or change other behaviors. What is the role of emergency managers for this? I'm thinking about the hashtag No Natural Disasters campaign and how this is also true for the risks associated with climate change, that it's all based on policy / past legislation, etc. Maybe you have some comments about how this sustainable development goals include disaster risk reduction.
Yeah, so yeah, this is like another way that climate change is connected to disaster work. So in the US, at least, we have not really connected climate change mitigation itself to disaster work. So if you're thinking about like mitigating climate change, meaning like carbon related issues, that isn't something that emergency managers have really been a part of in the US. That is kind of one of the ways these different areas are kept very separate from one another. I'm hesitant to say that that is a responsibility emergency managers should take on. I think kind of theoretically that makes sense, but I think in practice, emergency managers kind of have their hands full, and they're not really necessarily in a position to be able to do that type of work. But I do think that there is room for emergency management when we're talking about climate adaptation. So in the kind of climate sphere of things, we have climate mitigation, preventing climate change, and then you have climate adaptation, which is where we're talking about making changes to absorb the impact of the consequences of climate change. And this is where there is like very clear overlap to what we do in emergency management in terms of what we call hazard mitigation. There's some like complex terminology things going on here, but what's important is that there is this overlap, right? So if you're thinking about communities that are doing buyout programs or what they may be calling managed retreat programs along the coast because of concerns about sea level rise and storm surge, that is sometimes falling under the heading of climate adaptation. But that is also what we've done in emergency management for a really like many decades, right? There are these buyout programs, and that is falling under hazard mitigation. And so sometimes there's overlap, right? You can find communities that have done a good job of trying to connect their climate adaptation plans with their hazard mitigation plans. But more often than not, you see a disconnect between those two types of plans. So I think the kind of the space for emergency managers and kind of where they can start jumping into climate work more specifically is in that adaptation side of things. And then in terms of the No Natural Disasters campaign, so maybe let me explain that first. So the No Natural Disasters campaign was started by some other disaster researchers who are working to eliminate the term natural disaster from our vocabulary and specifically from the media's vocabulary. I think I mentioned this in my talk, but this term natural disasters is problematic because it suggests that disasters are these kind of natural, unavoidable events that happen that are kind of part of nature and that we have no control over. When in reality, we know, again, from many, many decades worth of disaster research that disasters are the product of human decisions, right? They're the product of policy decisions. The hurricane itself is not the disaster, right? If that hurricane goes out to sea and doesn't bother anybody, it's not a disaster. It's only when that hurricane comes ashore and it meets a community that hasn't prepared for it, that hasn't sent out warnings, that doesn't have strong building codes, that it becomes a disaster. And so the issue that many take with this term natural disaster is that it kind of obscures human responsibility, and it kind of it gives politicians or people in power a little bit of an out to say that, this is natural, there wasn't anything we could do, when in reality, we know that there is a ton that we can do to change policy and minimize our risk. And so the extent to which that connects in with the Sustainable Development Goals, look, there are, again, I've talked about kind of the distinction between the climate sector and the disaster world, but we also have the like humanitarian aid, we have the development sector. These we're all talking about related issues here. In my opinion, these areas are still quite separate from one another, and there's not enough linking between them, and not enough kind of taking this holistic approach to minimizing risk and to preventing us from making risky development decisions, and then minimizing that risk, and then also thinking about that within the context of climate change, right? It's still kind of branching out in these different ways.
All right, we have a question from Jocelyn. Okay. Disastertology is able to impressively stitch together research on climate change, emergency management, hazards, etc. Are there key topics where you see these research areas conflict or talk past each other?
Yeah, I think that, definitely the climate adaptation and disaster, or the emergency management and climate adaptation being kept separate. But a lot of the hazards research is pretty separate as well. A lot of that research, like when you go look in journals, is in these like really technical journals that, emergency managers don't have access to, they're not reading. Even emergency management researchers may not be reading it, or may not really understand it. So, we've definitely come a really, really, really long way in how hazard researchers and disaster researchers are communicating with one another, but I still think that there is a little bit of a disconnect. One example I'll give happened really recently with the heat wave in the Pacific Northwest. There were a lot of even climate scientists and a lot of journalists as well, who were very surprised, I guess is the word, about the heat wave in the Pacific Northwest. There was this kind of narrative forming that this heat wave was kind of worse than had been predicted when we're talking about climate research. And what does this mean? Like, has climate research failed us? And that was a very kind of confusing narrative for me, watching that. And I know for some other disaster researchers as well, because from a disaster perspective, a heat wave in the Pacific Northwest was very much something that the research would lead us to believe was possible. And I think one of the issues at the root of some of that kind of surprise or confusion had to do with some climate researchers not really thinking deeply about vulnerability, and not really thinking about how these extreme weather events are not the disaster themselves, right? It's how that extreme weather interacts with us. And if you don't have a really good understanding of those communities, if you don't understand what those vulnerabilities are, if you don't understand what kind of what part of the emergency management system is in place to respond to these types of extreme weathers, I think things on the ground may kind of look a lot worse than you imagined they would. And so I think that was a kind of a new example for me, honestly, of how perhaps there is still kind of a much bigger disconnect between hazard and climate researchers and disaster researchers and folks in emergency management.
Okay, we have a question from Luis. What other ways do you think? Sorry, what other ways do you think would be effective in communicating these issues to the general public? Obviously, your book is a fantastic resource.
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts about this. So media, I think, and through journalists, I think is maybe kind of the easiest and most obvious way of doing this. Journalists, when they are reporting on disasters, it's usually quite limited to the actual response. I think now that journalists, or some journalists, are trying to connect disasters to the broader climate conversation, that there may be some room to shift some of that, so we get kind of a broader coverage and kind of cross that disaster life cycle more than we have historically. But I think really kind of working with journalists, this isn't like an efficient way of doing this, but working with journalists one-on-one to really help them understand emergency management, to really help them understand kind of the scope of issues within disasters, help them change their narrative, right? Just like the No Natural Disaster campaign is trying to do, right? Shifting their language, shifting the narrative that we're seeing, integrating actual disaster research into their coverage, expanding the types of events that they're covering, expanding when they're covering it. That is, that's where people are consuming a lot of the information that they're learning about disasters. And so if we can shift these narratives, especially in like mainstream cable news narratives, I think that would potentially be a huge way to shift the public's understanding about disasters. So I think that's kind of the place to start.
Okay, we have a question by Andreas. Climate change can become a scapegoat for policymakers when disasters hit. Just as the same extreme events are also often rarely used by activists to make a point about fighting climate change. What do you think is the best way to communicate the urgency for climate change mitigation while also bringing the attention towards bad policies regarding physical risks?
Yeah, this is really important. So in the same way that the term natural disaster is inaccurate, the term climate disaster is also inaccurate. And I know climate activists don't love it when I say this, but it kind of runs into the same problem, right? It doesn't necessarily misassign blame, but it obscures a large part of the blame, right? Climate change is only ever one factor in a disaster that has occurred, right? It's not only climate change. That is not our only problem. In some ways, I wish that was our only problem, right? We have a lot of other major issues that are creating our risk, right? Decisions about how and where we're building our communities, right? If you build an entire new neighborhood in the middle of a floodplain, Houston, you are going to get a flood, right? That is going to flood. If you are not addressing social inequalities, if you are not making sure that people are able to evacuate, that people are able to afford mitigation in their communities, you are going to see disproportionate outcomes from disasters when they happen. We are an interconnected world, right? As we have learned during the pandemic, what happens in one part of the world can affect other parts of the world. If you're not dealing with those factors that are, colluding together to create our risk, you are not going to be successful in preventing disasters from happening, right? We cannot only address climate change. We have to be addressing these other vulnerabilities as well. And so you know, you're absolutely right. Climate change can kind of become a scapegoat in the same way that you know, historically calling these natural disasters or calling them acts of God have been, right? There is a real need for there to be a nuanced approach to talking about risk, to talking about what actually causes disasters. And that is not always something that happens in our media, right? And in fact, it rarely happens in our media, right? And that is one of those things that we need to see changed in the narrative of disasters, right? We need to see a push to not use terms like climate disaster, right? To make sure that we are, yes, absolutely talking about climate change, but also talking about these other policies and these other problems that are coming together to create these disasters.
All right, I think that's all the questions, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you so much for answering them. Great responses. Very, very interesting subject material as well. And if anyone still wants to stay tuned, we're going to do that little like raffle thing where we pick out someone's random name and you will actually receive a free copy of the book. So if anyone wants to stay tuned for that, we'll get that underway.
Thanks. Thanks, Alan, and thanks, Dr. Sam. Super, super reflective and great questions from the audience members as well. I know that we do have, the book is live, right? So it's now available on the disasterology.com website. Just waiting for Amazon to ship me my copy, and just can't wait to dive in and ask questions. This is a very technical random sample. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second and share the random number generator that's going to help us pick somebody special out. So again, not very scientific here, but thank Google. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the generate number and then pick the individual with the caveat that it can't be a paid staff member of KCI. We don't want to tip those cards because we'll all have an opportunity to check out Dr. Sam's book. But what I'll do on the order of the participants on the screen, click the number and then count the number of individuals. So it looks like it's number 3, which I show is Heather. Is it Buffa? So Heather, if you wouldn't mind just zipping me a note at jono@kportclimate.org with your contact information. I'll put it in the chat box here. What I'll do is I will get a copy of the book ordered for you and shipped as soon as Amazon so wishes. And really just want to, again, thank Sam for being here with us. Really the provocative intersection between disaster and climate, which I think is going to continue to unfold as we see some of these phenomena in our daily lives, some more so than others. But if you do have any additional questions, please do feel free to send those to me. I also want to thank Alan for your service today in leading the discussion and facilitating the conversation. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and sign off for today. But again, thanks to all of our audience members and to all of you that may be listening to the recording. Take care.